So it's been revealed that the National Student Financial Aid Scheme spent about 5 billion rand on students who don't qualify for that funding. An investigation conducted between 2018 and 2021 by the SIU raises the alarm about the state's failure to recoup these funds. Let's get your reaction to it now. Bring in the South African Union of Students spokesperson, Asive Dlangwa. Also joining us is the DA's Higher Education spokesperson, Chantel King. To both our guests, it's lovely to have you on the program. Thanks for speaking to us. And I suppose, Chantel, as a start, one of the obvious questions is how on earth is something like this able to happen? Because what the SIU says is that part of what NSFAS didn't do is see whether the students who receive this collective 5 billion rand actually apply when it comes to the funding criteria around the household income specifically.
Yes, but we must also be mindful that most of these anomalies occurred basically between 2018 to 2019, a little slightly into 2020. This is when the bad policy of fee-free higher education was haphazardly introduced, which basically created a big gap and a loophole for these irregularities to occur. There were no proper funding criteria available at the time. Also at the time, they were not clear how they were going to transition from a loan system to a bursary system. So that is where the ICT challenges came in, and that is where you would find that in most cases institutions saw the gap, but also we had officials that saw the gap in order to loot some funds out of the system, and that is then the results that we see today, where we have these 5 billion rand going out to 40,000 students. And now we need to get ourselves to a situation, what measures are we then going to put in place to recoup most of the funds, but also to ensure that proper punitive measures are in place.
Yeah. I wonder what kind of culpability, if any, Asive, you reckon the students should take. My understanding is that some of them actually flagged that they're not eligible for NSFAS. I presume what happened after that is that they paid back the money. Others, of course, took a chance.
Yes, Brian, and once again, greetings to you and your viewers, and thank you for having us. I think there are three things. Obviously, number one, there's the extent to which the student would have intentionally and deliberately sought to defraud the scheme. As the SIU noted that some of them would have used their grandparents' details to apply for that funding, knowing very well that their parents would not be within the bracket. So those students obviously would have defrauded the scheme, and to that extent there needs to be there needs to be consequences, which one of them would obviously have to include them having to pay back that money. So I think that we are clear that there has to be a level of consequence that must be dealt with. And then the second level, Ayanda, is the extent to which NSFAS system, as the MP has alluded, NSFAS system, the ability, or rather the inability for them to have been able to, and to even now to still be able to detect those things in the system. I know for the last cycle they have been working with SARS to be able to verify the incomes of the students when they apply using their ID numbers. And I think that has gone a long way in terms of assisting and dealing with that. And that was only for this academic year. So previously, I want to even say they almost had to take the word of the student that what they have presented and the evidence that they have presented is what falls within. So we think that will definitely go a long way in terms of systems. And then the third level also the MP has spoken to is the extent to which there would have been officials of NSFAS and university officials who would have intentionally sought to defraud the state, exploiting the gaps within the systems. So those also, they must be brought to the fore, and we must deal with that also as harshly, because obviously those people have not just defrauded the scheme, but they've defrauded the state, really, because those are state funds.
Yeah. And again, I suppose the question that still remains is the extent to which those students who received that money, not because of any kind of effort on their part, have spent that money but are no longer able to pay back. I mean, what does justice ask of those students, do you think?
Unfortunately, or fortunately, Ayanda, we live in a lawful state, and for where monies have disappeared and have been used in a manner in which they have not been used, there has to be consequence, because you see, in future, it's possible, as it happened to the student in Wusu who was transferred 14 million rand and she spent that. Although we did not agree that she be criminalized for it, but we believed that there had to have been some level of reparation. So there had to be, at the very least, either it be community service, or she must commit to paying a portion or all of that money back. But there has to be a consequence. The money must be paid back, even if it's not the full extent of the money, because then we will be in a lawless state. And once that happens, also the people that transferred the money, if they were able to get in fact, we will never know also altogether who was a willing participant and who was not. And to the extent to which we do not know, there must be some level of consequence, so that it does not create an impression that hundreds of millions and billions can disappear and no one takes account for that. So we must inculcate and teach that even to our students, to our young people, that there has to be a level of consequence. Maybe we might not agree to the extent to which they must be criminalized, and we must, which means their whole futures obviously will go down the drain, but there must be some level of consequence. Definitely, even if one partly paying back the money, and some, even if it's a level of community service that they must enroll in, so that they know that there is a level of consequence for what has happened.
Sure. Of course, there was that proclamation that was signed by the President in August last year, Chantel, essentially allowing the SIU to undertake or roll out these widespread investigations at NSFAS. Through that proclamation, we're told that about 33 million rand has been recovered from, 33 million it is, from a college in the Western Cape. The question I'm getting to is, to what extent do you reckon that piece of legislation will allow us to be able to recover any of this 5 billion rand, given how much time has elapsed since this money was apparently paid out?
Okay, so let's start on the Northlink issue on the 33 million, which they have recovered. The issue there then should then be what punitive measures was then instituted against Northlink, because they obviously made some interest on the money, which should actually be given back to NSFAS in its entirety, what was invested. So when the President signed the proclamation of the SIU investigation, at the time it was just to look at what monies was owed, especially when you consider the closeout report. What is of concern, though, is that the SIU doesn't really have strong teeth if the National Prosecuting Authority is not going to be roped in to ensure that there are criminal cases instituted against certain individuals in order to recoup some of the money, but also for the mismanagement of funds by some officials. Our biggest concern is, however, that we've seen various SIU investigations taking place. We just recently saw the one of the National Skills Fund, where there was an investigation. And yet till today, a report would come back to us to say that there are only sort of like 8 officials that were implicated, which raises the question, is it really 8, or who actually should be held accountable for the system's failures in the long run? So the SIU investigation is just going to look at the past, but it's not going to look at what is currently happening at NSFAS, and we will never be able to know the extent because the President is still sitting on a ministerial task team report that would look at a sustainable funding model, but also look at the reinvention of NSFAS as a funder for student funding going forward. So yes, there is an SIU investigation, but it will only be successful once punitive measures are implemented and once we see the recommendations that was given to the minister in this regard. Yeah.
The money that was paid out in relation to this 5 billion rand, we understand, was connected to essentially 76 institutions across the country. And, you know, as we keep finding out a bit more about just how NSFAS is run, Asive, one can't help but think of the plight of many students who rely desperately on the scheme actually working the way it should. We have been speaking for years, if not decades, about ways through which NSFAS's inefficiencies have a material impact on students being able to get through varsity and hopefully be meaningful contributors to society.
Absolutely, good, Andy. For as long as we are not able to run the scheme efficiently, the poor and the working class will carry on to suffer. You know, what is unfortunate with our situation in South Africa is that we are not paying enough attention to the institutions. The corruption that happens in the sector cannot happen outside being aided, abated, and having our university officials participating in that corruption. Let us look the 14 million rand so-called NSFAS incident where the student was paid. It was the institution with the service provider seeking to loot the state funds. Fortunately for us, then NSFAS had not yet made a payment to the university, so the university were paying advancements. But when that had been consolidated, that would have been 14 million rand that we would have lost. But it was not just it was not just the student, nor was it just NSFAS. It was facilitated by university officials. Hundreds of millions are being looted through the scheme and other funding models in the country through university. We are not paying enough attention to universities and colleges and to the extent to which they're involved in this corruption. I promise you it is not possible for the amount of funds that we have lost for them to be looted out of the system without colleges and universities playing a critical role and collaborating and colluding with some NSFAS officials and private service providers. So we really also the SIU, I can promise you if the SIU had to zone in a little bit into those institutions, we would be able to pick up so much more of the money that has been lost, number one. And number two, take the issue of the closeout report, for instance. There are institutions that willingly knew that they had funds that they should not be having that belong to the state, and they kept those funds, the funds that NSFAS would be trying to recoup. And there's been no repercussions, there's been no charges, there's been no investigation. It's just like, oh, so you shouldn't be having that, bring it back. And as if that is not state funds. Right. So we really need to take a more comprehensive approach to dealing with the corruption, and maybe we'll be able to deal with it more efficiently and effectively.
It's a question of consequence management. Yeah, it really does seem like the more we dig, the more we find. The lead investigator was speaking to Scopa yesterday, saying nonetheless that he believes there may very well be improvements in NSFAS's operations, and that may hopefully lead to us not having to deal with the story again. But for now, Asive and Chantel King, thanks for your time. Really do appreciate it. It's a story that we're still going to watch as it continues to unfold.